The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. It's become a truism that the Israeli-Palestinian peace process has yielded a fair amount of process, but no real peace. After 2 decades since the Oslo Accords were supposed to usher in a comprehensive settlement, parties on both sides are questioning the viability of what has been the cornerstone of peace, a two-state solution. With current political conditions among both Palestinian and Israeli leadership seemingly not conducive to dialogue, there seems little hope for progress anytime soon. But despite the many challenges, there remain those who persevere on the path toward peace, including our guest today. Joel Braunold is U.S. Director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace, a network of organizations working to secure a just and sustainable peace between Israel and Palestine. He is also a columnist for the Jewish World section of Haaretz. He previously worked with One Voice, an international grassroots movement supporting a two-state solution. Joel, welcome to International Focus.
Thanks very much, Doug.
Well, let's look at the landscape at the outset here. Let's start out with the run-up to an election in Israel. We had a coalition fall apart recently. Talk a little bit about that.
So the last government, the latest government in Israel, sort of was an amalgamation of the right, the settler community, and the center in Israel. And really, the objective of the last government was really to try and ask the question, where was the money? You know, a famous truism in Israel is that a third of society works, a third of society pays taxes, and a third of the society goes to the army. The challenge is it's the same third. And so the middle class in Israel were increasingly frustrated about the cost of living. And so what you saw were sort of the Naftali Bennett of sort of Habayit Yehudi, which is traditionally seen as the settler party, come together with Yair Lapid, who is the new centrist bloc, to throw out the ultra-Orthodox, to try and work out that, you know, this third who works, goes to the army and pays taxes, could try and reorganize the economy. But there were deep divisions on issues of peace and a two-state solution or not. And Naftali Bennett is a famous proponent of sort of annexation of Area C of the West Bank and against a two-state solution. And these sort of core problems, including Tzipi Livni, who was very much for a two-state solution, sort of led to the collapse of the government after they achieved their agenda of sort of widening participation and conscription in the army and other sort of key economic issues. The government no longer had any consensual issues it could work on and basically collapsed. I think the government lasted under 2 years, and we're now back on the polls, and Israel will go and vote on March 18th, and we'll see what happens.
Well, and in the last election cycle, the Palestinian issue really was not front and center by any means. As you suggest, it was much more sort of the bread and butter issues, was it not?
It was very much on the cost of living. I think that for international audiences, you know, they would assume that the Israelis vote primarily on, you know, do they want a two-state solution or do they not? But Israelis are like people around the world. They also vote on how much does it cost to fill up your engine in your car? How much does it cost to buy yogurt or cottage cheese? And sort of the massive protests that brought to power Stav Shafir and Yitzhak Shmuley in the Labour Party was of sort of what was called the J14 movement, where people were protesting the cost of living, and over, I think, a sixth of the Israeli population protested in the streets, sort of the crazy cost of living. So it was very much about economic issues. And just, you know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was very much on the back burner. And the Labour Party then, under Sheli Yachimovich, who was the leader, was running on the price of the economy and not on the diplomatic front.
And to what extent do you think the success of things like the physical separation of the peoples. I mean, and just the success of the security establishment to really limit the amount of violence that's going on made that possible. I mean, I think people in this country sometimes have the assumption that the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is front and center every day for every Israeli. And if I'm writing software and go back to my nice condo in Haifa or Tel Aviv, maybe I don't think about that so much.
You know, I think that there are times where the reality punches through sort of the almost apathy and often denial of what exists sort of 5 miles across a border. What happened in Gaza this summer is a good example of when the entire of Israel feels it, because it's a conscriptional army. So everyone had someone in their family go down to Gaza. The reality is completely different for Palestinians. This is an asymmetric conflict. The Palestinians feel the occupation by the IDF every single day and face the indignities of that. Whereas in Israel, you know, it's interesting, both communities feel very powerless to affect this situation and both assume that the others hold their key to success. And into this powerlessness, politicians who try to keep the status quo, and I think if there's one thing you can say about Prime Minister Netanyahu is that he stands for stability and, you know, making sure that, you know, everything's stable and calm, is that this is fracturing. I think that, as you know, there's a real challenge about, as it fractures, what enters into this vacuum? Is it despair, racism, separation, or do we try and inject not optimism and be Pollyannish, but an opportunity to demonstrate that the populations do have power and that they need to use this to actually promote and move forward on sort of coexistence, peace, security, justice, rights, and dignity.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the polling that's been done and how that's trending. I mean, the populace as a whole feels optimistic, less so?
You know, the Israeli, as you go around the world in the Pew polls, you generally find that the youth population is more optimistic than their elders. Sadly, this is not the case between Israelis and Palestinians or within their own societies. You know, we have a society that grew up in Israel during the Second Intifada, and then the Palestinians the same. You know, this was a society that grew up with suicide bombs and Operation Defensive Shield and all the things that went with that. And so we have really deep challenges, and the optimism and hope of the 90s doesn't exist amongst this population, and they don't have the human-to-human interaction that existed. And a lot of my members through the Alliance for Middle East Peace are trying to work on how do you rehumanize in every societal sector, be that the economy and education, how do you rehumanize these populations to each other? What I would say on polling is, look, fundamentally, around 59% of Palestinians on average and 67% of Israelis are willing to accept a two-state outcome. You know, it's important to say willing to accept because this isn't something people dream of. It's not, people aren't going to the streets and protesting. It's a compromise, and it's very hard to build consensus around compromise. But even though you have these majorities, the challenge is, you know, roughly 30% of that 59% or 67% don't believe it's going to happen 5-10 years time. And if you don't believe it's going to happen, you don't invest in it, you can't visualize it, and you don't vote for it. And because of that, you have this incredulity gap, this gap of belief that exists between people who are willing to accept a compromised outcome, but you know, the facts on the ground show it's not happening. So one of the challenges that many in my community try and traverse is to try and identify and create, you know, for lack of a better term, positive facts on the ground. And by positive, things that demonstrate building towards a future that show sort of, you know, a just and sustainable peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And they're doing that in a very hard and critical atmosphere, both locally and often ignored internationally.
So let's just do some of the math, if we would, electorally. We've got an election coming up. Now, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, has 120 members, so the magic number you need is 61, of course.
Very much so.
And so where are we in that calculus?
So we can go, you know, if you want to go very into depth, the Israeli election works in 3 stages. Okay, so it's not like America where you elect your congressman or you elect the president, and if you win enough votes, you win. It's a proportional representation system. So if you get more than 3.25% of the vote nationally, you get however much of that percentage you get the amount on your party list. So part 1 of the election is, you know, who gets the most votes. Part 2 is who gets the most members of that 120 body to nominate you to be prime minister. And then the third challenge is how do you build a coalition? So at the moment, we're in part one, sort of how do you build sort of, the voting part. And I think, for the first time, I would argue since definitely last election, you've got a real challenger to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Isaac Herzog, commonly referred to as Bushy Herzog, in coalition with Tzipi Livni, have come together, and they're polling sort of as a major bloc alongside the Likud, which is Benjamin Netanyahu's party. So this should be a cause for optimism if you believe that you need to change the Israeli government. You've got someone who's working and is an equitable sort of voting bloc. However, the way that the Israeli parliament is put together is you need voting blocs. And the challenge being that the religious right bloc in general is still polling higher significantly than the centre-left Arab bloc. And that's creating real challenges about where do the votes come from to create an alternative government. And we could go very much into sort of the minutiae of this, but one of my beliefs is 20% of Israel's population are Arab. And this year, the Arab parties are running on a joint list. And so there's a big push to turn out the vote. And it looks like, through projections, moving from last time when there was 54% turnout, there might be 70% turnout, which would increase their share on seats. Until there can be a way to work out how Arab parties can sit with Jewish parties in a left-wing coalition, I personally fear that even if you do get a centre-left government, it will be incredibly fragile without having it, because the centre and the left are fighting without a 20% part of the country that should be in their column. I think that's really a challenge, and I think that until we traverse that, we're up against sort of a real block.
Well, we've got just a couple of minutes before our break, but let's go to the leadership on the Palestinian side and what is the state of their ability to deliver the goods, if you will, for an agreement.
What's interesting is that you have a revolving amount of actors on the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, you've had Yasser Arafat, and now you have President Mahmoud Abbas. And there hasn't been an election in the Palestinian Authority since the one in 2005, due to the separation between the West Bank and Gaza. So there's sort of there's a challenge, there's a democratic deficit that's really being faced. The separation between Gaza and the West Bank also makes it very hard for President Abbas to speak on behalf of all Palestinians, because he doesn't have sovereignty, control of the territory in Gaza. He doesn't control the military forces. So there was a unity agreement that was very widely celebrated in Palestine to sort of show that, maybe they could have some sort of unity between those parts. The practical implementation of that has constantly stalled. So there's a challenge there. But an important thing to say about President Abbas. President Abbas's entire raison d'etre since he became the president was a non-violent strategy to get to a two-state solution. He was a huge believer in negotiations, and the failure of Secretary Kerry's approach has really led him to what's next. And you've seen the Palestinians move to trying to internationalize the conflict with the going through international law. And this is sort of where the hope is, because the asymmetry of power on the ground means that maybe they can find a more equitable situation if they go international. That's not going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's not going to end the occupation. But in my personal opinion, things that are non-violent are things that shouldn't be punished, in my personal opinion. But the Palestinian leadership have other challenges. How long can you be the leader if you haven't had an election? I think that that's something that is increasingly becoming talked about on the street, especially if decisions are made that are not sort of within line with where Palestinian civil society is up to at the moment.
Well, we're going to take a short break. We can talk a little bit about something you touched on, sort of the broadening of the discussion to international fora. But first, we'll take a quick break.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking with Joel Braunold about a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians. So before the break, we just touched on some of the movement, particularly at some of the UN agencies. So where is that at?
So the Palestinians have just applied to join the ICC, and the prosecutor there has decided to start looking...
This is the International Criminal Court.
Sorry, I apologize. And they're looking about if they can open a case. The Palestinians have arranged a committee. But, you know, the internationalization of the conflict in those sort of arenas looks to use international legal norms and sort of to try and help solve the conflict or sort of progress it in a way to try and limit, you know, to try and increase accountability. But I think for my community, one of the interesting things is at the moment, the international community hasn't been funding the peace movement in between Israelis and Palestinians in the same way, for example, that it did in Northern Ireland. I think that in Northern Ireland, what you saw was the International Fund for Ireland, that was sort of Speaker Tip O'Neill and President Reagan came together to fund, which was a multi-party fund that between 1986 and 2010 delivered $1.3 billion to peacemakers, Catholics and Protestants, that really formed the bonds that were necessary between Catholics and Protestants for the Good Friday Agreement. And roughly, there was around sort of $33 to $40 being spent ahead on sort of people-to-people work. When we look at this conflict and we look at sort of the contributions that are being made to our members, and roughly, you know, we're around $3.75 ahead. There just isn't the resources to help scale these programs. I think that if the international community is looking about how they can sort of rehumanize the communities to each other, as well as encouraging nonviolent activism and all the other sort of work that's going on, we need to try and work out how we can actually leverage off each other and create more resources for peacemakers to do their work.
Well, and you know, you touched on earlier the fact that communities on both sides can live their lives with very little knowledge of the other despite physical proximity. So to what extent is that the reality for most Palestinians and Israelis? I mean, how much opportunity for at least positive interaction is there?
So limited, and so I think that the role of the NGO community and the peace-building community for peace and reconciliation is to try and find opportunities in every societal sector to help interact, but not just have people meet, talk over hummus and go home. That doesn't, you know, it doesn't, you know, that's the kumbaya stuff that people criticize people for all the time. The programs that a lot of my members are doing are project-based. A good example, Echo Peace, for example, have got Jordanian, Palestinian, and Israeli mayors to agree to stop pouring sewage into the Jordan River and put fresh water in. This is a real-world solution for these communities. You know, another group, Sofen, is placing Arab citizens of Israel into high-tech stuff, really improving their economic work and dealing with racism in the workplace in other ways with other groups as well. I think that the more we can find project-based work or work that leads to real changes in communities, we can actually find opportunities to build that sort of really important individual transformation and leverage it up to institutional transformation. Another great example is the Israeli educational system is actually segmented. You can go to a religious school, you can go to an Arab school, you can go to a secular school. And one of my members is a group called Hand in Hand that do bilingual Arab Hebrew education and actually has a mixed school environment. And that was the school that sadly some extremists firebombed at the end of 2014. And President Obama actually invited kids from that school to the Hanukkah party at the White House to sort of show what a shared educational future could be. You know, Hand in Hand caps out at the moment at 5 schools. And the reason they're at 5 is because there's a lack of funding, even though the Israeli government matches any dollar that's brought in. And in order to scale these programs, be they cross-border or within Israel between the different communities, we need to grow that resource. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing at the Alliance for Middle East Peace is trying to pass legislation at the moment to create an international fund for Israeli-Palestinian peace, copying what worked with Northern Ireland and applying it to this conflict specifically.
And is this very much something that occurs in the NGO sphere? I mean, is there, how much involvement by sort of official Palestine and official Israel should there be? Is there?
You know, I think that they're very aware. You know, these groups are registered with their governments. Some of them, the less political ones, some of them are very pro. Some of them, you know, are slightly more critical depending on the programs. Of the actual fund itself, generally, no one we've met with has objected with the concept, as long as the money is vetted and people know who it's going to, with the concept of scaling up the resources for these programs. And we've actually been working with Congressman Joe Crawley and Congressman Jeff Fortenberry from New York and Nebraska, a bipartisan bill to be introduced into Congress so that Congress can take the lead on the creation of a fund like this, but wouldn't have to pay the entire amount. The aim would be that we would create a $200 million fund, of which Congress would put in $50 million, the EU member states would put in $50 million, the rest of the international community, including some of the Arab states, would put in $50 million, and the private sector and philanthropic sector would put in $50 million. And this would allow us to radically scale these programs. But the members on the ground, and it goes back to how much the officials know, a lot of them are working out how they can sort of leverage off each other's successes. And the work that we do on the ground is to try and help them compete less and partner with each other more. And in doing so, find opportunities to sort of take someone who goes through a hand-in-hand school and then plug them into an environmental charity or something else so that they have the ability to go through this work. And you know, unless the people within the Israeli or Palestinian governments we're meeting with are sort of dedicated against sort of moving towards an equitable, sustainable future, no one's against these programs fundamentally. They may have some criticisms here and there, but people are looking for opportunities that can really make a difference on the ground. They're just very few and far between.
So it sounds like you know, these are longer-term propositions. If you're changing mindsets of school children, that's not going to result in the moment on the White House lawn anytime soon.
But when we did have the moment on the White House lawn in '93 and seeds of peace were there, people now ask, where are the trees of peace? You know, I think one of the interesting things you mentioned, Doug, is, you know, when Kerry's process didn't work, no one says, well, let's not try and do negotiations ever again. When an economic state-building program fails, no one says, hey, let's stop funding economic progress. But when, you know, the civic process of people-to-people work fails, people are like, well, let's stop funding that. So it's my community who are punished for failure. But if you want to see a constituency for peace, if you want to see a constituency that knows the other, these things are long-term projects. Of course, they have measurements and impacts they need to demonstrate now, and they do. A good example, the Abraham Fund did a lot of work around this year, Eid al-Adha, the holiest day, one of the holiest days in the Islamic calendar, and Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, fell on the same day. And this was during sort of just this past year when there was so much violence around Israel between Arabs and Jews following sort of the war in Gaza and the kidnapped sort of kids on the Israeli side. And there was no violence on that day. And one of the reasons was that the Abraham Fund had taken religious leaders from both communities and with police and went all around the country doing sort of educational systems. How do you measure the impact when violence didn't break out? I think that one of the challenges has always been, you know, well, I get it if, you know, there are 61 votes that go up, you know, but where are the trees? Well, you know, a lot of the key MKs did come through some of this dialogue work. A lot of them did, and a lot of some of the leaders are starting to show through. But we can't yank the constituencies. You know, a hand-in-hand school kids system doesn't just affect the kids, it affects the communities, the parents. In cities where Arabs and Jews don't mix, if they send their kids to the same communities, that's whole parents, that's friends of parents, that's communities of parents. When an Arab-Jewish basketball team that Peace Players International ran wins the under-18 girls basketball league in Israel, that matters. This is something that demonstrates that coexistence can work. I think that our challenge is to try and communicate that message that, yes, some of this is longer term, but this is the hard work of peacemaking. If you're hoping for a moment on the White House lawn, it doesn't happen just from the top. It needs to be sustained from the bottom. The work that my community does isn't sufficient to bring peace alone, but it is necessary. And for too many people, the work that my community does is just cute. It's nice, it's, you know, it's kids. This work is not nice, it's necessary. Just as necessary as the economic work and just as necessary as the political work. And until the international community and the Israelis and Palestinians recognize you have to do civics, economics, and politics all at the same time, and that all of them need a seat at the table and the resourcing in order to scale to succeed, I feel like we're going to constantly fail.
And if the funds were there to scale it up, do you think the numbers are there for members in both communities who would be inclined to participate?
Yeah, I think that when you look at recruitment, MEET is a wonderful example. The MEET is a great organization that works with MIT and trains 15 to 18-year-old Palestinians and Israelis in coding techniques with MIT undergraduates. They do hardcore technical programs. They have a 4% acceptance rate. They have literally hundreds of people desperately applying to get in. And yes, so some of it is you need to be a certain academic level, but another thing is there's just not the funds. Hand in Hand has a waiting list for their bilingual schools longer than private schools in this country, but there's just no capacity. EcoPeace, one that I mentioned before, has, I think 20 freshwater communities that does this work. They'd love to be in 40, but there's not enough money. But it's not just money. It's also an ambition to the community scales their ambition alongside it. It's not about more people doing more programs. It's about understanding how do we transition from individual transformation to institutional transformation. And I think that a lot of them are starting to think about how they can work better together. And that means, some groups work on a political level, some work on an economic sphere, some work on the grassroots level, and we find a way to connect all of these people together.
Well, we do a fair amount of programming on this particular issue. We don't often end on an optimistic note, so thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Joel Braunold. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.